Hey everyone, Kibler here. Today I want to talk a bit about the current state of the metagame in Hearthstone. Since United and Stormwind, there have been a lot of different takes on the current state of the metagame, and many of them not so positive, though there certainly are some who are fans of the metagame we have right now. And I want to address this specifically because I'm not having as much fun playing Hearthstone as I usually would expect to be this early in an expansion cycle. And the reason for that isn't necessarily that there's any individual overpowered deck or even a couple of overpowered decks, but it's just the way that the metagame has shaped up based on what is powerful and what is popular. And there's been a lot of people talking about how, oh, this is a combo metagame, it's a solitaire metagame, everyone's just killing each other by, turn 6 and ignoring what each other's doing. There is some truth to that to some extent if you actually look at the sort of power rankings, the tier lists of various decks in terms of their success. Looking at HS Replay right now, for instance, the most successful decks include 0 combo decks. They're decks like Face Hunter, Hand Buff Paladin, Elemental Shaman, Shadow Priest, Warlock, Zoo Warlock specifically, are, among just the most successful decks right now. But one thing that you don't see, if you focus specifically on like tier lists and win rates, is really the texture of the metagame. And, while it may look like there are a diverse, variety of decks that are successful, if you really break it down, you'll note that every single one of those decks that I just named is an aggro deck. And you say, oh, well, it's an aggro metagame. And you say, well, sort of. Because if you then sort by popularity rather than by win rate, and you look at legend data, the most popular deck is Hand Buff Paladin. And then as you go down the list, you have Quest Lifesteal Demon Hunter, you have Quest Mage, you have Quest Warlock, you have Face Hunter, but you have a lot of these decks, a huge percentage of the metagame, if you go down and add up all the various Quest decks, and specifically even if you ignore stuff like Quest Rogue, but you specifically are looking for essentially the solitaire type decks, right? The decks that kind of do their thing, largely ignore what you do, and kill you with something you can't interact with. That's the key here. Is the solitaire meaning isn't necessarily like, oh, I'm just doing my thing and trying to kill you quickly. It's that I'm doing something that you can't stop with normal Hearthstone game mechanics. And if you consider stuff like Lifesteal Demon Hunter that, if you consider stuff like Quest Mage that, consider Quest Warlock that, if you consider Garrote Miracle Rogue that, if you go down the list, there's like something like 25 to 30% of the Legend metagame are these combo decks, these solitaire style decks, these largely uninteractive decks. And while, as I was saying before, looking at sort of the tier lists of the most successful decks, those aren't the decks that you see, right? If you just look at the most successful decks, it is the aggressive decks. And they are able to beat these combo decks. So the problem isn't necessarily, oh, the combo decks are too good. The problem, in my mind, is there's too many that are good enough to see play that essentially every slower deck, every controlling deck, every mid-range deck is more or less completely pushed out of the metagame. And that is a really frustrating experience if you're someone who looks for, not necessarily just playing control, but looks for the opportunity to play a variety of different types of decks. There are definitely a lot of powerful, aggressive strategies and ways to pressure these combo decks, so that you can kill them before they get their combo off. We see a lot of people having a lot of success with cards like Battleground Battlemaster or Cult Neophyte, or just Smork hit you in the face. But those aren't really options for a controlling strategy. Something like a Cult Neophyte just kind of buys a little bit of time and then they still kill you anyway. Something like Battlegrounds Battlemaster is only relevant if you have a lot of pressure and you're actually reducing your opponent's life meaningfully, which isn't something that a slower mid-range deck or control deck can realistically do. I specifically say slower mid-range because I really do feel like Hand Buff Paladin is a mid-range deck, and Hand Buff Paladin being successful, I think is indicative of, yes, you can be successful with some degree of mid-range deck, but what makes Hand Buff Paladin able to be successful is that it is a deck that can compete and beat the aggressive decks, and also has enough pressure to beat the combo decks. But one of the things you don't see sort of in this dynamic, again, is any form of control. And that's the big reason you see the tier list, the most successful decks, entirely populated by these aggressive decks. You can't play Control Priest or Control Warrior or control shaman or anything like that in a metagame where 30% of your opponents are essentially impossible for you to beat. I went and looked at the metagame, not just the metagame breakdown, but the matchup breakdowns of some of these decks. And you have decks like Control Priest or Control Warrior having like win rates in the teens against some of these combo decks. And I think that some of those are generous because those often include players who, like play their quest, complete their quest, and let you mutinous their reward. Like that's the sort of way you have to win in some of these instances. Or, you overdraw your reward with evocation or something like that because you just don't really know what you're doing. Or you're, not quite playing, precisely enough and you make a mistake. That is just, it's not just a matter of like how often do you win or if the metagame is balanced. Is this a fun metagame to play in? And if you're someone who enjoys combo decks, it's a great metagame, right? You have a ton of options, you have a bunch of different puzzles to solve. If you're someone who likes playing aggressive decks, cool, they're great. You're never going to get controlled out. But if you're someone who wants to play, again, a diversity of playstyles or any kind of slower deck, it's very frustrating because the metagame essentially insists that you have the capability of winning by like turn 6 or 7, or else your deck is largely meaningless in a lot of these matchups. You don't feel like you even participate in the game. I was doing some thinking of, okay, well, what could you change, right? Like, how do you actually fix this metagame? And I think that there's a variety of ways that you could nerf any of these different decks. And one of the problems, as I'm sort of saying, it's not a matter specifically of balance, right? We're not saying, oh, this specific deck is a massive power outlier. Part of it is a matter of the fact that there are these accumulated decks that are all reasonably powerful, and they end up having a sufficient metagame share as a result of their popularity and their relative power level, and the fact that, yes, people think they're fun. And again, I'm not saying that people shouldn't think these types of decks are fun, or that they shouldn't enjoy playing them, or that those decks existing in any way is a problem. But I do think it is a problem when those decks exist at a sufficient level of population in the metagame, and with few enough actual interaction points for opponents who are not looking to just kill you, that you essentially push the entire archetype of control or slower mid-range strategies out of the metagame. If you look at the Grandmasters deck list for this week, I went through, and I might have missed something. I was going through, and I didn't like individually look at every single thing, but I was going through all the lineups, and I found a single lineup, Bank Yugi in Asia Pacific, who was playing Control Warrior and Control Priest. Outside of that, among all of the deck lists in the entirety of Grandmasters, I found 0 other control decks. And I think that really speaks to the sort of state of where we're at. Yes, you can bring a lineup that includes multiple control decks and try to prey on the people who brought multiple aggro decks in an attempt to beat the combo decks, but you don't really have decision-making going on outside of like, hey, I hope I get paired with the right stuff, right? Like, I feel like the decision-making process all happened before the game when you have such incredibly polarized lineups, and that leads to just less fun games to play and watch. Again, I feel like the solution to this has to involve not just like, oh, we're going to nerf a card in a deck. I think it has to be either you're like introducing some like fundamental shift to the way that like these quests work, which I'm not necessarily convinced is a good idea. Something that allows them to slow them down and potentially be more vulnerable to disruption. Or you need to hit like a number of things in order to make it really, I think, viable for people to even try to play controlling style decks, right? And it might involve like, oh, hey, we hit like these quest decks a little bit so that their population decreases to the point that now the aggressive decks are less likely to run into these, and now there's a smaller percentage of the metagame that's represented by combo, and thus you can potentially play control, right? I would prefer that there were just sort of more ways to interact with combo generally, because I actually think it's kind of frustrating that we had the introduction of a great anti-combo tool in the mini set recently in Mutinous, and Mutinous is trash against quest decks unless you are playing aggro. Mutinous actually can be great if you're pressuring them enough that they have to play, they can't just like sit back and play their complete their quest whenever they feel comfortable and play their reward in the same turn. But if you're pressuring them, sometimes you're able to mutinous their, they have to do it, and you mutinous their reward, and haha, you feel brilliant. But the way that it stands, like, they never have a minion that matters in their hand if they care about they just care about the quest reward until they complete it and complete it in the same turn, right? And maybe if we want to have like a structural change, the quests like you got the reward at the end of the turn and they switch to the next quest at the end of the turn. that might be too big of a shift in terms of like, hey, it fundamentally changes the quest lines. It is kind of thematic in that like, oh, you have to go turn in your quest and get the next part of the quest line or something like that from WoW. But I'm just sort of spitballing ideas of like, how do you have a broader strokes solution to this that sort of creates some amount of counterplay to the quests and their rewards. I think that might be too big of a shift. That you have to complete it and then play it the following turn. But I do think that they are in general exceptionally powerful right now, and the sort of immediate reward can be absolutely huge in the case of something like either the mage or the warlock quest. If you have absolutely zero way to possibly interact with it, it's almost impossible to beat those in control. Specifically a mage, the quest reward is only a problem insofar as like the deck also has a bunch of other ways to take advantage of it. Like the warlock quest is its own win condition, right? The mage quest ends up being essentially supplementing spell mage and making specifically Ignite and Cram Session so good. Spell Mage has been a deck that was previously the number one deck, got nerfed, and was kind of not quite good enough for a while largely because like people were playing decks like Priest that could actually out heal your damage once you no longer had like the sheer raw potential that existed before. But now obviously with the combination of the quest reward and Ignite, you certainly don't run out of damage. I've always advocated that I feel like the biggest issue in Quest Mage is the combination of Incanter's Flow and so much card draw. I really just wish Refreshing Springwater had never been printed, but given that it has, and I doubt that we really want to hit that again, I think potential solution there, we could just finally actually nerf Incanter's Flow to some degree. I think Incanter's Flow either going to 3 cost or only reducing your spells to a minimum of 1 would go a long way toward hitting that deck without completely neutering it. As far as the Warlock quest is concerned, I feel like the most egregious cards there are actually Dark Glare and Stealer of Souls. Stealer of Souls, obviously got banned in Wild, and I think that in Standard now, with the sheer amount of power you have from the quest and the ability to actually turn Stealer of Souls kind of cost into a win condition in itself, the card becomes pretty outrageous. In the previous metagame, when Priest was kind of public enemy number 1, I was talking about how I felt like the real problem there was Raise Dead, and I didn't really want to hit Raise Dead because I felt like Raise Dead was an interesting card for Warlock decks. Now I feel like Raise Dead is actually one of the big problem cards, especially alongside Dark Glare, giving you a ton of additional resources, advancing your quest, and frequently generating mana for 0 mana is pretty insanely powerful. So I think that potentially nerfing Raise Dead is within the realm of reason, but I think the real problem cards, as I was saying, are Dark Glare and Stealer of Souls. And I think that while you still could potentially have like essentially an inevitable win condition in the form of Tamsin plus Fatigue, if you slow down the explosiveness of those decks by changing Dark Glare and Stealer of Souls in some capacity, you really end up, fixing a lot of what I think that the sort of problems are with facing that particular deck. And again, I think that there is the possibility of nerfing all these different things. And, I have long considered that at least Lifesteal Demon Hunter is a really, really frustrating deck. I do think that Mutinous at least does something against that deck because you can remove their Moargs, or at least remove a Moarg from the game. There's a number of different things you could do to nerf that deck, whether it's changing costs of things or, sort of big thing I advocated for a while ago if you wanted to basically kill the deck. But, if you don't want to kill it, then you can't really change like Fell Scream to only target opposing minions. Fell Scream targeting friendly minions means there's no counterplay to like not playing enough minions on the board to give them lethal, which I think is an interesting dynamic that could create, opportunities to use the deck and have the deck be powerful in some matchups, but not necessarily be able to do its kind of explosive 100 damage thing from 0 board. But again, I don't necessarily feel like any of these individual decks is the problem. The problem is all of them in aggregate being as good as they are and making up as big a share of the metagame as they are because they're pushing control out. So I'm not necessarily looking to just like, oh, I have to nerf this deck and this deck and this deck to this degree. It's that I want to find an equilibrium where combo is, not 30% of the metagame, maybe it's 10 to 15% of the metagame, and control can actually kind of sneak back in there and start beating down some of those aggro decks. But when you don't have the sort of interactivity with the ways the combo decks win, I wonder how that equilibrium can really shift, which is part of the reason that I think that having like ways that you can theoretically interact with these, like the sort of making the delayed reward and allowing something like Mutinous to potentially work could be a more satisfying answer. And there's ways to play around that too. You start building your Spell Mage with Wand Thief and keep it in your hand against the control deck, so that you can try and protect it from Mutinous some percentage of the time. So anyway, that's where I'm at with the current metagame. And again, I don't think this is an issue of like an egregious balance outlier, egregious balance problem. There's a wide variety of decks that you can play and be successful as long as you want to play an aggro or combo deck. It's kind of like the Henry Ford quote or whatever. You can have any color you want as long as it's black. You can play any deck you want as long as it kills your opponent by turn 6. So anyway, thank you all very much for watching this. I know that this is a very sort of controversial and in some cases heated issue among members of the community. I'm curious to know what you all think. I'm curious to hear what you think are the problem cards, decks, what you would change in order to potentially shift that equilibrium a little bit and give us a little bit more variety in archetypes that are viable in the current standard format. So let me know in the comments what you think, what you would change, or if you're happy with living in, the Hearthstone version of Combo Winter. That's a Magic reference. Way throwback. I think there's Combo Winter and there's Combo Summer. There's just been a lot of combo times in Magic. But in Magic, there's more interaction, and that's what I want in Hearthstone. If you're going to have combo decks, let me interact with them. Anyway, thanks for watching. Let me know what you think. I'll see you next time.